Brazil is the largest country in South America. When we think of Brazil, we think of the beautiful city of Rio de Janeiro. We think of the waterfalls of Iguazu with all their splendor. Or we think about football and famous football players. But we don't think about leprosy. Yet until 2005, Brazil had the highest prevalence of leprosy in the world and still registers 40,000 new cases every year. Within Brazil, for 60 years, the Acre state had the highest incidence of leprosy. For decades, people who feared they might have the disease hid away and came forward only when it was too late to help them. Such was the case of this pretty 16-year-old called Dora. When she discovered she had leprosy, she hid away in the jungle and didn't come back to town until 20 years later, when her hands had been crippled and her feet destroyed. But today, that has all changed. People come with just a small skin patch that can be cured. When skin examinations for early diagnosis of leprosy are announced, everybody comes. Until recently, 110 out of every 10,000 inhabitants of the state of Acre had leprosy. That has now dropped to below 2 in 10,000. And the strange thing is that this dramatic change was brought about by a boy from Belfast, who was one of the worst students who ever attended Belfast High School. His average mark in Latin was 7%. Yet, in the Ministry of Health in Brasilia, Brazil's capital city, there's a portrait gallery of all the leading Brazilian surgeons and scientists, and among those illustrious portraits is one of that boy. I call to the platform Dr. William Woods. Dr. William, this tribute comes from the people of this state. We all love you. He's an honored member of the Acre Academy of Medicine. He was twice honored by the Brazilian Minister of Health, and he received an OBE from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth in recognition of his sterling work.
I have been 50 years now in the Amazon rainforest, and as we think together of all that the Lord has done in spite of me, I ask you with me to magnify the Lord and let us exalt His name together.
I was born on the 5th of October 1937 at 50 Ranelagh Street in Belfast. When I was barely 2 years old, the Second World War began. My father was an Ulster volunteer. He was not conscripted. His ship, the Empire Hope, was one of the first ships on the Malta convoy to be destroyed by enemy planes overhead. As it sank, the order was given to abandon ship, but he and another man remained on board until the waters of the Mediterranean put their guns out of action. This brought an invitation for the family to Buckingham Palace, where he was decorated by the late King George. In the meantime, my mother rented part of the schoolhouse in Ballygowan, where we spent the war years. As the war drew to an end, the family moved back to live on the Ravenhill Road, where I attended as a child the Ravenhill Free Evangelical Church. But it wasn't until I joined the 30th BB Company, attached to Orangefield Presbyterian Church, that I first came really to understand the gospel. Sunday school teachers and BB officers took me to a gospel meeting in McQuiston Presbyterian Church, conducted by Oswald Smith from Canada. It was there I indicated first my desire to become a Christian, but because I was 12, I was given a little decision card to sign. However, I soon started attending again the Ravenhill Free Presbyterian Church. An enthusiastic young preacher was beginning his long career, and it was there on the 5th of July 1952 that I accepted the Lord as my Saviour.
Whether you be religious or irreligious.
When the new church was opened in White Abbey in January of 1953, I was there, and in White Abbey I would preach my first sermon. Another teenager led the meeting that night. His name was John Douglas. I would later work again in White Abbey with the late Cecil Harvey from Crossgar. At a missionary meeting in the Martyrs where Mrs. Eads from the Cape Verde Islands was speaking, I first felt the Lord was calling me to full-time service. Mrs. Eads was better known as Jessie Munn, and the Munn family, especially Emma when she came from Africa, would have a great impression on my life. Some of us from the Martyrs formed the Victory Testimony Band. We cleaned out a barn in Macroscrews where we held a gospel mission. Many people were saved who are still in the Lord's work today. Mr. Jim Douglas from Newton Ards Baptist, a young girl called Betty, today a member of the Martyrs Memorial with her husband. Dr. Paisley would later go there for a gospel campaign, but he only stayed a week and I had to carry on. Followed up by Reverend David McElveen, another mission, and out of that small beginning, the Ballygowan Free Presbyterian Church was formed. In 1954, I got to know outgoing missionaries to Brazil, Fred and Ina Orr.
1937, that the Lord opened the door for us to go to Acre. In company with Miss Morley Harvey, we landed in Rio Branco.
Fred and Ina were going to Brazil with the Acre Gospel Mission. They were sent out by Castlereagh Baptist Church. At their final meeting there, Ina sang that beautiful hymn, Let Me Burn Out for Thee. The next night there would be a large crowd at the boat to wave the couple goodbye. They would travel to Liverpool where they'd take a Booth-Line steamer that would take them 1,000 miles up the Amazon. They travelled on the Hillary. After a few days in Manaus, they would then travel for 1,700 miles on the River Purus, the longest tributary of the Amazon. It would be a long, slow journey on a paddle steamer. It would take them at least 3 weeks, and perhaps more. The steamer would stop from time to time to take on wood to burn in its engines and keep the paddles turning. After some days, they would have to change to a smaller steamer as the river got narrower and drier. After 8 days on the Sunday evening, Ina said, I've got fever. There was nothing they could do. They couldn't turn back. The steamer just went on and on and on. There was no one could speak English. They couldn't speak Portuguese. And every day Ina seemed to get worse. At the side of the river there was just a few houses. But then on the Friday evening at 4 o'clock Ina became delirious. 6 o'clock she went unconscious. And 8 o'clock in the evening she went to be with the Lord. The first missionary to arrive in Labria was not to preach the gospel, but he wasn't welcome even so. He had come to bury his wife. Fred would return to Labria after he had learned the language, and he stayed there for some 17 years. Today there's a very strong church that supports their own pastor and has sent out and support missionaries to other parts of that river. They even have a seminary where they prepare students for full-time service. The church has just recently bought its own boat to take the gospel to the people on the rivers. Fred would move to Manaus after 17 years, where he started another church and where he started another seminary. He later married and today is surrounded by his wife and family. But when the news of Ina's death came to Ireland, it came as a great challenge to many young people. And I felt God was saying I sought for a man to stand in the gap. Following Dr. Paisley's advice, I began my training for full-time service at the Missionary Training College of the WEC Mission in Scotland. 2 full years and difficult years, because I was always sick. Finally, a few weeks after my 21st birthday, I was accepted for work with the Acre Gospel Mission. However, I would stay in Northern Ireland for another year. We had gospel missions in conjunction with the Faith Mission in Northampton, very near the old Cabra Church, and in the Craig's Mission Hall and in Maboy Mission Hall. Again, many people were saved at those missions. Some today are still in the Lord's work, like George Wright from Cullybeck. Finally, in 1960, in August, I was ready to sail for Brazil. Again, there would be a large crowd of friends gathered at the boat to bid me goodbye. And I would travel to Brazil on the Booth-Line ship, the Hubert, which would take me 1,000 miles up the Amazon. I spent 3 months living with the missionaries in Labria, where I studied the language, Portuguese. My first Christmas away from home ever I spent in the Bogotá Acre with the late Miss Molly Harvey. And finally in 1961 I moved to Canatama. Canatama was just one street along the edge of the river. It was a very small and backward town, and then one street penetrating into the forest from the edge of the river. Our house was one of the best houses in town. We had a modern kitchen and a modern kitchen unit, sink unit here. Because we had no ceilings, we just had to be accustomed to the rats on the headboard of your bed at night. But you got used to it after a while. My first task in Canatama was to help in the building of the church. The wood was taken from the forest, sawed, planed and put in place. It was a great day when the church was finally completed. But we were there to build up the living church. And after some years the Lord gave an abundant harvest in that little town. The old wooden church has now been replaced by a permanent brick building. My first year in Canatama I lived with Jack and Joan Maudsley. Joan was a nurse, and when she left on furlough, people still came to the house looking for help. I was called to see a boy bitten by a snake.
Where is the nurse?
She is on holiday. She's not here.
My family spent 6 days rowing a canoe to get here, with me under a plastic cover, and she is not here.
But I'm going to send you to Manas. In Manas there's a hospital and doctors and nurses, and they will take care of you.
Como vai me mandar?
How are you going to send me? If there's a boat leaving today, it would take 10 days to get there.
I'm going to send you on the plane. It comes once a week.
What day does the plane come?
On Thursdays.
What day is today?
It was hard to tell him that it was Friday. I told him I would pray for him.
I don't want you to pray for me. I want you to do something to help me, to ease my pain, to save my life.
He died on Sunday morning. A little graveyard in the forest just outside Canatama. It's a simple cross that says Haimundo Nonat, but to me it used to say, do something, do something. A few days later a neighbour sent me some fish.
Donna Marie sent this for you.
Oh, it's fish. I must have done. It's very hot.
It doesn't matter. It never hurts when I burn my hand.
Come into the house and let me see your hands.
Yes, his hands were indeed burnt. How could a little boy burn his hands and not feel pain? I got out Mrs. Maudsley's books and I discovered, yes, that little boy had leprosy and nothing was being done to help him. And then I discovered in almost every house in that little town, someone had leprosy and was hidden away. But what could I do? God would fit me for the job he was calling me to do. Not far from Canatama is the mouth of the McComb River, and in the McComb there's another tributary, the Forbidden River. It was on this river that lived the very, very hostile Juma Indians. No one ever entered into their village and came out alive. Many of their victims were found without heads. We thought they were headhunters. But God sent wonderful American missionaries with a vision to reach the Juma Indians for Christ, no matter what it cost. They would travel up the Forbidden River, and at the side of the river there, near the Juma territory, they would construct a little house where they would live, sometimes even with their family. In order to travel from Canatama to the Juma River, the late James Gunning would give Arne his boat, the Good News, to facilitate that travel. From time to time I would go with Arne into the villages. We never saw the Indians, but they saw us. Sometimes it took us 3 days to go there and get back again. We took Eted, an Indian from another tribe, hoping that she would tell the Indians we wanted to be their friend. But before she could get the message over, they came out and killed her. The final break after 6 years, when Arne met 2 of the Indians on the trail.